Welcome back. It is Bible Scribe. Thank you so much for joining me yet again. This video I'm going to call the progression of the pagan nations. And so what it's going to be about is this body of research I've been doing into the time of Christ in the Roman Empire and prior to that, and how all of these events culminated in the first century. Of course, the 70 AD narrative with the destruction of the temple. There's a whole lot of context surrounding all of that that I really want to understand better. So I've been studying Rome specifically a lot, but I've also then dove into some of these other pagan nations and how it got to be Rome that was at the center of this conflict between God and his people Israel. And Rome seemed to be this third entity that was, again, under the power of the beast, being used by God to wage war against Jerusalem and cause its downfall in 70 AD. So my logical mind wants to ask the question, how did it get to that point? Why was Rome seen as this seat of power for the pagan gods? Because that's what the picture that's given to us in the book of Revelation with the picture of Babylon. Because at the time that Revelation was written by John in, say, 65 AD, there was no Babylon. Babylon had been defeated, and the nation didn't exist where it had originally been built in the area of Ur, and the area of the Chaldees, the Fertile Crescent area. So we have to understand why John used Babylon as the reference for Rome. And this progression of the pagan nations, and specifically their gods, the progression of these pagan gods through the nations, is what I'm looking at in this case. So join me on this tour. We're going to go through not only the Bible, but a few other apocryphal writings, and then talk about how this progression of pagan nations ended with Rome being the seat of power for all of these pagan gods at the time of Christ. So we're going to start with the Bible, and we're going to go to a couple places you're probably very familiar with in Bible prophecy. Now, the pagan nations that we're going to talk about, the Bible, of course, mentions pagan nations in many different places. All sorts of places in prophecy, as well as the other books in the older parts of the Old Testament. But we're going to focus on this area because everyone knows it. But the book of Daniel in chapters 2 and 7 represents four nations that are specifically important to the time of both Daniel through the next few hundred years till the time of Christ. And so that's where we're going to start today. So I'll bring up Daniel on the screen for you. And we're going to go straight to chapter 2 and briefly talk about the vision that Daniel had of the statue. If you remember, there's a statue that he sees in his vision. He relays this information to Nebuchadnezzar. It's Nebuchadnezzar's dream that he can't understand with this statue. The head is gold, the shoulders and arms are silver, the torso is bronze, and the legs and feet are iron mixed with clay. And of course, this represents the four nations that are to come in the next few hundred years. Those nations, starting with the gold, are Babylon. Then the silver is Medo-Persia. The bronze is the nation of Greece. And the iron mixed with clay is a reference to Rome in the final kingdom before Christ would come. And of course, that's why God gave these visions to Daniel. So that's in chapter 2, and that starts down in, well, the whole chapter 2 is about the dream and the statue, but the statue part is down further in the chapter. It's a pretty long chapter. The secret that's revealed in the vision starts in verse 30. So Daniel 2, verse 30, 31, Daniel says, "King, you saw, behold, a great image. The image," meaning statue, "whose brightness was excellent, stood before you. The head was fine gold, his breast and arms of silver, his belly and thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part iron and part clay." And so that's the vision he gets of this statue that represents four coming kingdoms. And of course, those are explained further down in the chapter. So let's jump over then. Let's go back and go to Daniel chapter 7. because this is where the vision of the four beasts is. We had the vision of the four parts of the statue. Now it's the four beasts. It's the same information repackaged in a different vision. And of course the vision is explained, so it's not some kind of strange symbol that we can't understand. He explains the vision in both cases. So it's not meant to be a question mark that can't be answered. So here in chapter 7, in verse 3, we start to read about the beasts. It says, 4 great beasts came up out of the sea, diverse from one another. The first was like a lion with eagle's wings. I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted from the earth, and made to stand upon its feet as a man. A man's heart was given to it. This first beast, the lion with eagle's wings, is a representation again of Babylon, the first kingdom that was in progress at the time of the vision. Of course, Daniel was living inside Babylon, but that's the first part of the vision. The second beast, verse 5, behold another like a bear. It raised itself up on one side, had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and they said thus unto it, arise, devour much flesh. So the Medo-Persian Empire is what's represented here. The Persian Empire, a known kingdom of warriors that was known for their battle tactics, their viciousness. And so that is very apropos for the vision of the bear that devours flesh with its mouth. Verse 6, I beheld, lo, another like a leopard, but had on the back of it 4 wings of a fowl, and the beast had 4 heads. Dominion was given to it. This leopard, it's fast, and the Greek kingdom spread very fast and took over the known world at the time. And this was just prior to the time of Christ, 100 years BC or so, before it started losing power. And so that is what's being represented by this leopard beast. And then in verse 7, after this I saw the night visions, behold, a 4th beast, dreadful, terrible, strong exceedingly, had great iron teeth. It devoured and brake into pieces and stamped the residue with the feet of it. It was diverse from all the other beasts that were before it. Again, reinforcing, these are all different kingdoms, each one. And it had 10 horns. So the details of the beasts are not as important in this case as we're studying this, quote, progression of the pagan nations. But it's important to understand this vision because it talks about these 4 kingdoms and how they progressed, one to the next, to the next, and to the next. And I'll admit, before this idea and this concept came to my mind, I hadn't thought much about how did these kingdoms relate to one another. Not only are they in the prophecy together, but was there a relationship between why it was one kingdom, then the next, then the next, then the next, and that was a prophecy given by God, that it was going to occur this way. Very interesting, and it may have more significance as we go through the rest of this study and understand a little more about these nations. So now that we've seen that this, quote, progression of the pagan nations does seem to exist, at least in some degree, in the Bible, I'm going to take you now to another writing, or actually writings, that contains this same type of progression of the nations. And this other writing is an apocryphal work called the Sibylline Oracles. Let me bring that up on the screen for you. So this is a PDF version of the Sibylline Oracles translated by Milton Terry. There's a few out there. I generally have read most from the Charlesworth translation of the Sibylline Oracles. But the way I understand it is this is a group of Greek writings that were considered oracles, meaning prophets. And so they came out of the time period preceding these different nations coming into power, specifically or particularly before Rome came into power. Now, there's, of course, scholarly debate over the dating on some of these things, but really what I'm looking for in this case, or what struck me, is, for one, these are full of rich information about the nation of Rome and some of the prophecies and things that were expected to happen at the time of Christ. And so that's what first interested me in these writings. But now what I've seen is that it references the same type of progression of the nations. And with my key interest being on the worshipped gods of these nations and why it seems that the same gods of the Roman period may have been the gods from ancient periods in other nations, including Babylon, including Egypt. So the Sibylline Oracles, in many of the different oracles, so different writings, 3 or 4 different writings we're going to look at, they're called the Sibylline Oracles, but they're different writings from different prophets. 3 different places we're going to go here, we're going to see the same progression of nations talked about as a prophetic discussion, a prophecy that these were the nations in order that would rule the world and through which history would run. And so I just wanted to be able to show you that and give you that evidence. So the first spot we're going to look is in book 3. Let me see if I can get my references right, make sure I don't miss one. Book 3, line 159 or so. Let's see here. Book 3, let me try to get there. So if I can get there and find this section. So here in book 3, and in this translation, it's around line, looks like 190 that we're going to start reading, but that's different depending on the translation you're using. In Charlesworth's translation, it's like 159. So just be aware that the references are different in different translations. But we're going to start reading here for now. Let me see if I can get this on the screen where you can see it easier. So you see here in line 191 we'll start. It says, the Egyptian kingdom, then that of the Persians, and of the Medes, and of the Ethiopians, and Assyria, and Babylon, then that of the Macedonians. Egyptian yet again, then that of Rome. And when a message of the mighty God was set within my breast, it bade me proclaim through all the earth in royal hearts, plant things which are to be, and to my mind this God imparted first, how many kingdoms have been together gathered of mankind. So there's a lot in these oracles. So we're just hitting a little smattering of it. But you can see how all of the nations that we just talked about in Daniel are referenced in these prophecies. Now this one's not as clear cut, meaning it's not talking about only Babylon and then Persia and then Greece, then Rome, but yet those nations are referenced. And it's part of this lineage, comes from Egypt, and then Macedonia, Medes, Ethiopians, Assyrians, Babylon. All of it seems to be talked about in a similar sense, that there's this progression, that they're all connected somehow. And of course, my mind when I was coming to all these things was, are they connected in the sense that they worshiped the same gods? Because that's what I was interested in. So let's check our next reference in the books of the Sibylline Oracles. And that is going to be in book 8, right at the beginning of book 8. So let me get back to the content so I can find that. Let's see, book 8, page 55 in this translation. All right. I'm just going to start at verse 1 in this oracle because it's really interesting, regardless of whether it's all pertinent, but there's not much here. So starting here in verse 1, God's declaration of great wrath to come in the last age upon the faithless world. Now remember, when most of the prophecies are talking about the last age, it's usually talking about the time of Christ and the successive 1,000 years. Okay, so that would be the final age that they're all talking about, the quote last days from the Bible. Okay, I make known, it says, prophesying to all men according to their cities, from the time when the great tower fell. Now that great tower, talking about the Tower of Babel, and the tongues of men were parted into many languages of mortals. First was Egypt's royal power established. Now here's that progression of the nations we're talking about. Egypt's royal power established. Then that of the Persians and Medes, and then also the Ethiopians, and then of Assyria and Babylon. Now Babylon, of course, that dovetails into Daniel's prophecy. Then the great pride of boasting Macedon. Then fifth, the famous lawless kingdom, last, of the Who? The Italians. That's Rome, the last kingdom of Rome. Shall show many evils unto all mortals, and spend the toils of men on every land. And it shall lead the untamed kings of the nations to the west, make laws for the people, and subject all things. Late do the mills of God grind the fine flour. Fire then shall destroy all things, and give back to the fine dust the heads of the high-leafed hills and of all flesh. So this is, again, focusing on these nations. It's talking about Egypt. And you're going to see this again and again, just as we did in the prior reference. Egypt, Persia, Medes, Ethiopians, Assyria, and Babylon. And Macedon, by the way, Macedonia, likely a reference to the Greek nation, the Macedonian Greeks. Now let's find our last reference here in the Sibylline Oracles, where again, by the way, remember that these are all different writings, not from the same person. They were from different prophets, different seers in the Greek kingdom, as far as I understand it. So this last reference is in Book 11, lines 6 through 121. We may or may not read all of that, but let's see. Book 11. So let's go to that. Page 64 in this version. And we'll just start in line 1 because, again, it's the same type of message as the last book that we read. O world of men, wide scattered, long walls, these cities huge, nations numberless throughout the east and west, south and north, divided by various languages. Again, this seems to be a reference to the Tower of Babel and the scattering of the languages of men. And kingdoms, other things, the very worst, against you I am now about to speak. For the time when on the earlier men the flood came, and the Almighty One himself destroyed that race by many waters, then brought he in yet another race of men, untiring, and they, setting themselves up against heaven, built to height unspeakable. Okay, now that's the Tower of Babel, a tower, and tongues of all were loosed again, and on them hurled came the wrath of God Most High. So you see how all these oracles start out talking about the evils, the wickedness of mankind in the past, and how God was going to bring it to head again with this progression of the nations to the final nation of the last days, Rome. Line 15, by which the tower unutterably great fell, and against each other they stirred up an evil strife. And then of mortal men was the 10th race since these things came to pass. The whole earth was among foreign men, various languages distributed, whose numbers I will tell, and in acrostics of the initial letter show the name. Now here we go. Here's the progression of the nations. And first shall Egypt, royal power, receive preeminent and just. Of course, Egypt, the ancient Egypt, was the first mighty kingdom of the earth. Okay, so this makes a lot of sense. Then we'll skip down here a little. We'll see that it mentions then the east and the offspring of Assyrian men. Then 10 strokes of judgment upon Egypt. 10 strokes of judgment, that would be the 10 plagues against Egypt that are recorded in the Bible. You see how this lines up with Scripture. Then Memphis, talking still about Egypt. Then we'll continue down to the next page. Then shall arise the Persian sovereignty, and an evil shall befall the Jews. Okay? All this again lines up with Scripture. Going down, the Persians and the Medes. Again, I don't want to read all of this for you, but you'll get the picture here with these different nations being mentioned again and again. Then we have the Ethiopians mentioned again, as we did in the prior references. And then coming down, we see then again the Assyrians mentioned, then the Persian land, and then Italian soil. So Italian soil, of course, being Roman soil, the Roman land. And you see, without reading the entire narrative, you see how the progression is still there in this longer passage, just like in those other passages which just listed them out. This one takes and tells the story of each nation as it goes through history. And note here in the final passage that it talks about Egypt, and this would be the late kingdom Egypt that was still, Egypt was still active at the time of the Roman Empire. And you see here in this passage, it starts mentioning Egypt, saying, warning Egypt that all this dreadful stuff is going to happen to it. And it says down here that your royal power, meaning Egypt's power, would be given unto the Roman king. And that Egypt would, in that sense, become a slave then to Rome and would pay the price for all the wickedness it had done in the past. So you see how it folds in together and it all connects. And these different nations are all part and parcel of this story of progression from the ancient times all the way to the time of Christ. And they all are connected in one or another way. So I think you see in those passages in the Sibylline Oracles how it mentions again and again these specific nations over and over again. So this is what intrigued me. This is what intrigued me when I saw all of this. So I started thinking to myself, we have in Revelation the reference to Babylon. And of course, many of you on my channel or other viewers have made comments about the view of Rome and Babylon, and who is Babylon? Is it Rome, or is it? A lot of people think it's Jerusalem. Of course, there's a lot about that prophecy in Revelation that doesn't match Jerusalem. So I have a whole nother video on that Babylon is Rome, and so I'm not going to go into that here. But the reality is that the reason Babylon's Rome is because in Rome was the same seat of all the pagan gods that had come out of Babylon. And what intrigued me about this progression of these pagan nations was that I thought, well, it makes sense that these gods would be carried from nation to nation to nation, because if Babylon was not in power at all at the time of Christ, when Revelation was mentioned, this final kingdom called Babylon in that time, which obviously didn't represent real Babylon, I mean physical Babylon, it must have represented these pagan gods that were from Babylon. And so finding out that those gods were seated in Rome was one of the great revelations of this whole process for me. So I realized that this progression of the nations was not just nation after nation. There was a reason for that. It was because the gods moved the centers of worship from nation to nation to nation, ending in Rome. And so I'm going to take you on that journey now. We're going to look at how those gods progressed from nation to nation. So I'm going to bring up now a list. Now, this is my research on these pagan gods. Now you can see this is a list of the pagan gods that I have studied now up to this point. And I've collected information on each of them. These are gods from Egypt. These are Persian, Babylonian, Sumerian gods. These are Greek gods, and these are Roman gods. And so amassing all of that, you can imagine that would take some time. It has. However, it's been very interesting and has definitely kept me digging, because I keep finding the connections between the gods of these different nations. And of course, you would understand that their names would change over time. And they would be required to do so because the languages of these nations were different. And of course, the languages changed because God set that to happen at the end of the Tower of Babel. Each of these nations had their own language. And so as the seat of power moved from nation to nation, what really was happening, if you've spent any time with me in study and you've spent time in the Word and started to understand the angelic spiritual powers behind nations, then you understand that the power in a nation is due to its principality, its spiritual leader, which is an angel, and in some cases is a not a good angel, could be considered a demon. Those are the apparatus of power in nations. It is the spiritual apparatus. It is not necessarily a king or a person or a man or whatever. it's the spiritual principality behind that nation. So as God is telling the prophets that this nation will be powerful, now this one will rise up, now this one, it's because those gods are moving location from nation to nation, being repackaged with new names for each of those languages through history to perform God's will in the end times, the last days, which were the time of Christ during the Roman Empire. And that's what we're going to look at now, because you're going to see now that I've put together a chart that does this exact thing, shows us all of these pagan gods. So here you can hopefully see this chart pretty well. I'm just going to kind of go down through the list here and show you how everything seems to connect between these different pagan gods and pagan nations. There's a lot of information here, so I'm going to try not to dwell too heavily on any one particular god, but just to at least mention each one and where they come from and why they connect so well. What I've tried to do is map each of these gods. You'll see along the top I have Sumerian, Babylonian, Egyptian, Persian, Greek, and Roman. And then I tried to, on the far right-hand side here, put a reference to a biblical character that might also be related to that god. And that's not to say that these gods, that the Bible characters are these gods, but another concept that I'm learning about is that I'm speculative that a lot of the concepts from these pagan gods originated with biblical concepts. And it's because, of course, God is the one true God. And his son, the Word, the Logos, Christ, was his son and was known. And then, of course, you have the earliest humans, Adam and Eve, and some of the patriarchs. A lot of those things were lifted, I believe, from what we consider Judaism, but really were lifted because they were the real true things. And they were distorted by the principalities, the angels, perhaps the watchers that came down in the time of Enoch, and distorted the understanding of mankind. But that's why I have that column over there. Some things do seem to relate to references in the Bible. Some of the gods are outright just stated in the Bible, and that will be noted as well. But as we go down through this list, you'll note here in the first column, the creator. In a lot of these pagan religions, they had creator gods that were seen as the one that created the known world. And so in Sumerian, we have Anu or Ea or Enki. And then in Egyptian, ancient Egyptian, we had Ptah. And then in Persian, it's Ahura Mazda. And in Greek, it's Prometheus. You'll notice that these gods are not the primary deities. In most of these pagan cultures, the creator god was not seen as one that they would worship. And now that's important and interesting because if, like I said, the fallen angels came down and distorted the understanding of humanity, they would then, of course, push humanity away from the worship of the one true God and push it towards the worship of themselves, the angels themselves. So that could be what we're seeing here. And the reason that there's a creator God in these different nations, pantheons, however, it's usually not worshipped very much. Then it's interesting, there was a couple references in a couple of the pagan nations to the first, quote, man, which of course in the Bible would be Adam. But in Sumerian, there was a man named Adapa, which was seen as the first man. And then in Egyptian, there was Atum, which is a cognate of the word Adam. And so it stands to reason that they lifted the name Adam and used it as their, of course, interpretation of the first man. And they used the Egyptian word for the Hebrew word, Atum. And then Ra, by the way, is also seen as a type of Adam in the sense that Ra, as a sun god, was a reference to the sun, but Adam, in many cases, even in some apocryphal Christian texts, the sun is seen to represent Adam, and the moon is seen to represent Eve. Now, I'm not saying that's a necessarily Christian concept, but it was mentioned in Christian texts. So just be aware that that is partially why I have some of these references on this chart. For instance, this one for Adam as the first man with Adapa, Ra, and Atum. Then we have the first woman, who in Babylonian was considered Lilith. Now, this is a bit of a misnomer. Lilith does not translate specifically to Eve, but just have it on here in this way because the Babylonian Lilith was seen as the first woman, whereas in Judaism, of course, Eve was seen as the first woman. And of course, there are Hermetic and Gnostic sects that believe Lilith was kind of a twin of Eve, and that she was the counterpart to Eve, and that she, Lilith, copulated with Adam as well as Eve copulating with Adam, and out of Lilith came the Hermetic lines of descendency, and out of Eve came the godly lines of descendency. And of course, the Hermeticists don't believe in worshiping God like we do. They worship Satan. So the Luciferian line would have come out of Lilith. Then the man that survives the flood, that is actually mentioned in the Sumerian and Babylonian texts. Utnapishtim in the Babylonian and Atrahasis in the Sumerian texts were mentioned as the one who comes out of the flood, the man who comes out of the flood. And of course, that would be Noah in the Bible. And in the Greek, there's a man named Deucalion who came out of the flood. So it's a very interesting parallel that still seems to exist there. Then the interesting thing too, I feel like I've found good reference to Satan throughout these different nations. Now in in Sumerian, I'm gonna make sure I say it right. Yeah, my first column is Sumerian. So Sumerian would be Ashur or Enlil or Hadad. Now, these are different gods, but they each represent either the counterpart to the creator god, meaning the opposite of the creator god. So, of course, in Hermetic lines, God and Satan are kind of like twin brothers. They're two sides of a coin. Of course, we know that God is the Most High God, and that's not the case. But in these other religions, which came out of, essentially, it's a Hermetic line. It's a Luciferian line of religions. The counterpart to the creator God would be the equivalent of Satan. And so in the Sumerian, that's Ashur. And in then there's also an idea in which Satan is the prince of the air in the Bible, right? The prince of the powers of the air. And in Sumerian, Hadad is that deity. And so you can see how it seems to match up. And then in Babylonian, Marduk is the deity that would be Satan in our understanding. In ancient Egyptian, we have a few different names for different reasons. Now, Apophis and Apep seems to be the name of the actual legitimate correlation to Satan. Apep or Apophis, it's the same word, different spellings for different, I think, time periods. Then you have the Ouroboros, which of the symbol perhaps of the Ouroboros. That's a symbol of a snake that eats its own tail, right? Well, that's actually also a god, if you will, in the Egyptian pantheon. And so for the simple reason that it is a snake, and it's represented as the snake that fights against, I believe, the sun in an effort to keep the sun from rising. It's an antagonistic creature. And so in that sense, it seems to match our ideas of Satan pretty well. Of course, being a serpent definitely matches the idea of Satan also. And then in the later kingdoms, the name given to some of these deities was Ammon. And then Horus was also a deity of the underworld. So I related it slightly to Satan as well. And then in the Persian pantheon, Angra Mainyu was definitely the opposite of the creator god. And so that god seemed to match perfectly with Satan out of the Persian pantheon. Then in the Greek, we have Ammon, which is the same as the Egyptian Ammon. By the way, the Greek pantheon borrowed a lot of Egyptian gods. Some of them even kept the same exact name. So for instance, this is one. Ammon in the Greek pantheon is the same as Amun or Ammon in the Egyptian pantheon. And then Zeus included here because Zeus is the god of the air, the power of the air. He commands lightning. And so he seems to be also a relevant corollary with Satan himself. Then in the Roman pantheon, we have Jupiter, which seems to be the correlation to Satan, and Jove is another name for Jupiter. And then Harpocrates, which I believe is another underworld god that may have a relationship to Satan. But mainly it's, of all these, it's mainly Jupiter, Ammon in the Egyptian, and then Marduk and Enlil or Asher. Asher being the Assyrian, Enlil being the Sumerian. Those are the real corollaries with Satan, and Angra Mainyu in the Persian. But you can see how every single one of these progressions of the pagan nations includes the same gods for the same reasons. They just, of course, changed names. In some cases, they didn't even change names. I'll try to go a little faster so that we don't take too much time with this. But I this is so interesting to me. I'm having so much fun studying this stuff. The bull, we have a bull that is represented in many of these religions. In Sumerian, it's Asher. Or excuse me, that would probably be Assyrian. It's Asher. Is actually represented as a bull. Then in Egyptian, that bull became Apis. And then the same bull figure in Greek was Nevis. And then in the Bible, we have a reference, an interesting reference that many scholars have trouble with, called the bulls of Bashan. And I have heard in some circles that does relate to Satan in some regard. So it's just an interesting reference that I found between all of these religions. Now, when it comes to the sun, we have in Sumerian Shamash or Utu, that's the same god, just two different names. Then Ra in the Egyptian. In the Persian, there was Var-Katzva and Atar. And I don't remember the difference between the two of them. In Greek, we have Apollo, who was related to the sun, and of course Helios, which was the god of the sun. And so it's interesting to me that in a lot of cases in both Greek and Roman, we have two gods that represent one in the more ancient texts. And the reason is you usually had one god that was the caretaker of a thing. So for instance, Helios, the caretaker, or the actual sun personified, but then another god, Apollo in this case for the Greeks, that was then ascribed to the sun, that actually did stuff. And it was Apollo that was generally worshipped. Helios was not necessarily worshipped, but Apollo was. So it's interesting how that kind of plays out. And that's why we've got so many names, especially in the Greek and Roman pantheons, when it's really, there's just one god that was worshipped as the sun god. It was Apollo. Although Helios was known as the sun itself, or the creator of the sun, or the caretaker of the sun. And then in the Roman pantheon, we have Apollo. Again, it didn't change name between the Greek and Roman. But then also we have Janus and Sol. Again, Sol, just like Helios in the Greek, was literally a personified sun. It was the sun personified. And it really wasn't worshipped. It was Apollo that was worshipped and Janus that was worshipped. So it's just a very interesting dynamic. And then I put in the Bible column Adam here just because of those references that Adam was like the sun and Eve was like the moon. Not to be worshipped, of course, in any Christian literature or anything like that, but simply that the sun and moon were a representation of Adam and Eve. So there's a few gods in these pantheons that have to do with the rising of the sun or rebirth of the sun, because especially in the Egyptian ancient kingdom, the sun was something that was born each morning, rose and had a life cycle, and then died at the end of the day. And of course, in the Egyptian pantheon, like I told you, the Ouroboros, the snake god, was attacking the sun and trying to kill it. And if, as the sun went and died and went to the underworld at night, if the snake was successful, then the sun was not going to rise again the next morning, as what they had as a part of their mythos. But that whole idea of rebirth every day is what we're now talking about. And in Sumerian, that was the god Utu, which we've already mentioned. In ancient Egyptian, it was Khepri. That was the god of that rebirth, that sun rising. And then in Persia, it became Mithra. Well, that's interesting because that god Mithra carried straight through to the Roman era, and then you see a god named Mithras in the Roman era. And if you remember there's statues of that god. I think I can get those and show them to you real quick. So here's a particular statue of Mithras from the Roman kingdom. You can see it often had the body of a man, sometimes represented with this lion head, but it was entwined in a snake. And it generally would also, you can't see it in this statue because it's broken, it's an old statue, but it would carry the caduceus, which of course is the snake circled around a staff. And so that was the image of Mithras. Of course, that idea, it comes straight out of Egyptian mythology, Egyptian mythos, Egyptian religion, Hermeticism. But that's the Mithras that was worshipped at the time of Christ that the early church fathers wrote about. It was a blood cult, that they would drink blood as a part of their services. Now we get down and we talk about the moon. The moon in Sumerian was represented by Nana or Sin, her name, both things. But then in some of these also have not only a Sumerian name, but a Akkadian name. And so another name is Ningal, I think for the same god, but those represented here for Sumerian. And then in the Greek, it was Hecate, Selene, and Artemis that were all representatives of the moon, or the same underworld type character of Nana from the Sumerian. And then in Roman, this changed to Diana, who was also called Jaina or Luna. Luna, obviously a reference to the moon, but that was Diana. All the same god, same goddess. And then, of course, that would be, as far as the moon is concerned, a representative of Eve, the first woman in the real religion, the real one true religion. And again, I do believe all of these ancient religions like this, all of these ancient Hermetic religions, I believe they were all knockoffs of the real thing. And that's why these relationships exist. Moving on to the underworld, we see, and this is actually about the place, the underworld, Hades. So you see in Greek it's Hades, in Roman it was Hades, and in the Bible it was in Hebrew Sheol, and in Greek Hades. But in Sumerian that was a place called Kur, and in Egypt it was a place called Duat. Okay, that was the underworld. So that same concept, of course, carried through all of these religions as well. The keeper of the underworld in Sumerian was Erishkigal, and in Egyptian was Osiris. Then in Persian was Eryminos. Then in the Greek we have Hades as not only the name of the place, but the keeper of the underworld. And then Pluto, also represented as the god that would be the patron god of the underworld. And then in Rome, we have Hades, and Serapis became that ruler of the underworld. And then in, of course, the Bible, it's named Hades. So you see how it all plays together. It all seems to flow through each of these. Every single deity that I was looking for through all of these nations, I found in every single one. It's just amazing. And we'll come down here and we'll look at, there seems to always be a goddess of fertility, a goddess of passion or prostitution. And so that does carry all the way through every single nation. Inanna in the Sumerian. Then in Babylonian, it was Ishtar and Lilith and Semiramis. Now, these are all, again, different names for somewhat different deities, but also each town, each city would name their deity differently sometimes. So in a lot of ways, these are all the same deity, just at different names or time periods where they occurred. In ancient Egyptian, we have Isis, was the fertility goddess. And Isis, by the way, in Egyptian was also known to have been a consort of the underworld, of the rulers of the underworld. In Persian, we have the Tabiya, which was a jinn. If you know or are familiar with the jinn or the genie mythology, then the Tabiya was one of those, but was seen as the goddess of fertility in the Persian religion, Zoroastrianism. Then once it gets into Greek, you have Astarte, and then you have Isis as well, because it carried the name straight from Egyptian. Like I'd said, the Greek often carried the Egyptian name. Egypt was still actually active at this time as well. So the Greek borrowed a lot of its gods from Egypt. So there's Isis, Persephone, and Aphrodite. All these goddesses had to do with this fertility or prostitution idea. The main ones, of course, being Astarte and Isis. And then in Rome, it was also, again, Isis. And then Venus was another goddess of fertility or sexuality. And then, of course, in the Bible, the name straight from the other pagan nations was Ashtaroth or Astarte. All the same thing. So that goddess of fertility born straight through every single one of these nations. Now, in regards to an interesting god that I found was included in all of these pagan nations was a scribe god, a god that sat in heaven and took down notes and wrote things on secret holy scrolls, a knower of secret knowledge or sorcery. And so in each of these pagan nations, there was always a god like this. In Sumerian, it was Marduk that was the keeper of secret knowledge or sorcery. Then in Babylon, it was Nabu. In Egypt, it was Thoth or Anubis. Then in Greece, it was Hermes, the messenger god. But he was the messenger because he was bringing the writings to tell people about things. In the Roman pantheon, it was Mercury, who was the scribe, the writer of secret knowledge. And then, of course, in the corollary for us in the Bible, for anyone, the only person we know of in the Bible that was the scribe, the heavenly scribe, was Enoch himself. He was taken to heaven by God to be God's scribe in many of the ancient writings. Just a very interesting corollary that seemed to go through every single one of those ancient pagan religions, was the idea of this heavenly scribe. I found an interesting corollary between the gods of these nations that had to do with medicine or healing and snakes in general, because I have done quite a bit of research on the Roman and Greek god Asclepius, as you see over here, for Greece and Rome. But there are gods in the Sumerian pantheon, Ninazoo, that was the same thing, a god of healing, also a god of the serpent. And then in Egypt, it was Imhotep, which was the same thing, was the healer god. A very interesting corollary that I found between those. And then one final god we'll go to is the god of agriculture, which is interesting because this, again, flows through every single one of these religions. Starts in the Sumerian with Tammuz. Another name for Tammuz was Dumuzi. Then in Babylon, it was Dagon. And you know of this god from the Bible itself. It's in Ezekiel chapter 8, as it says over here. The Dagon was mentioned as the god, the idol that fell on its face before the Ark of the Covenant. It was the Philistine god. Then in Persia, this god of agriculture would have been Tiri or Tishtira, and then Haoma were two gods that seem to have something to do with agriculture. It's probably one of the two that matches this Tammuz or Dagon. And then in Greek, it was Demeter and Adonis that had to do with agriculture. And in Rome, it was Ceres. So again, another one of these threads that runs right through every pagan nation. And when you see enough of these, you start to realize this can't just be like coincidental. They all seem to have gods for the same things, for the same reasons. And they just simply changed names over the centuries. So that gives you the idea of what I mean when I call this the progression of the pagan nations. And I do feel it all culminated inside Rome in the first century, and that's what God intended. He intended that because he waged war against these pagan gods. And so the next thing I'm going to show you, which is really amazing, and it's actually what kick-started this search of mine, it got me into this study. And it's some information I found out about Rome, about something that happened in Rome after the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Because if you remember, Revelation prophesies against Babylon, and it sounds like God's going to come down on Babylon and tear it down to the ground and burn it and all this other stuff. And of course, many people who think that that has to do with Jerusalem, more power to you. Jerusalem did burn. There was some things that seem related, but the problem was that all those gods weren't seated in Jerusalem. Yes, there was some pagan idol worship going on in Jerusalem, but the seat of power of those gods was in Rome at the time of Christ and the time of the siege. So we look at Rome and we think, perhaps did God actually do any of those judgments on those pagan gods? Well, what's really interesting about that is that we find that he did. So you'll note the title of this article I've got in my database here, Fire in Rome Destroys the Temples of the Roman Gods in 80 AD. Now, it's interesting. Did you know that this had occurred? Because in 80 AD, a fire broke out in Rome and burned many of the Roman gods' temples down. Believe it or not. And this is recounted for us in the writings of Cassius Dio, in the writings of Orosius, and likely in a few others that I didn't spend more extra time going to because I found so much information in those writings. So in Cassius Dio's Epitome of Book 66, verse 24, section 24, it says this: however, a second conflagration above ground in the following year, meaning 80 AD, spread over very large sections of Rome, while Titus was absent in Campania, attending to the catastrophe that had befallen that region. You know what catastrophe that was that he was attending? That was the eruption of Mount Vesuvius that happened in 79 AD, the year before. So in 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius erupts, destroying the centers of decadence of Herculaneum and Pompeii. And as I've shown you guys before, there was just rampant sexual promiscuity in those areas. They had temples to the gods in those locations as well, but it was rife with brothels and prostitutes, where that was the point of going to those places, was to enjoy the city of prostitutes, essentially, in Pompeii. And that was what Titus was attending when this fire broke out in 80 AD. He was down there trying to help them lead the rebuilding effort in Herculaneum and Pompeii, because Mount Vesuvius had erupted and destroyed those cities completely. And so as Titus was down there working on that, a fire breaks out in Rome itself, burning down many of the temples of these gods we've just talked about. Burned in this fire was the temple of Serapis, if you remember us talking about that god. Serapis, I believe, I felt like was a reference to Osiris, Isis, and it said that the statues of Serapis represented Hades or Pluto, the king of the underworld. So this god is definitely one that God would have taken judgment upon. The temple of Isis was also affected in this fire. Here's the remains of the temple of Isis. That right now it's just a shambles of what it used to be. Now, did God leave these ruins for all humanity to see throughout history that he had overcome these gods right at their front doorstep? It seems pretty amazing to me. The Septa Julia, I'm trying to remember what this building is. A building in the Campus Martius section of Rome. That was where all the pagan temples were, where the citizens gathered to cast their votes. So it was built by Julius Caesar. So this would have been their voting center, their center of government. The baths of Agrippa were destroyed in this fire. The Pantheon was destroyed in this fire. Here's some original sketches of what the Pantheon probably looked like, done by someone, I think, in the 1800s. An amazing building, but again, one that was in worship to their pagan gods, and so it was destroyed along with the others in the fire. The Dribitorium, the Theater of Balbus, they were destroyed in this fire. The stage building of Pompey's theater, the Octavian buildings together with all of their books, the Temple of Jupiter, and the surrounding temples. Now, the Temple of Jupiter, if you'll remember, here's models of the Temple of Jupiter. The Temple of Jupiter, Jupiter was the representation of Satan, if you remember that correctly. So the simple concept here that God literally took out judgment in fire upon these ancient pagan gods that followed this progression of pagan nations. God prepared these gods to be destroyed in this time period, to be overcome, to be put down, to be shamed. And he did so in 80 AD with this fire that took over and burned many of the temples of the pagan pantheon in Rome. So that's the list, quite a bit of what we call, and you saw it mentioned in one of these articles, the Campus Martius, the entire area of Rome that housed the pagan centers of worship. That's what burned down. The year after Mount Vesuvius had burned down their sexual centers of worship in Pompeii and Herculaneum, the next year, as Titus was trying to rebuild that, God sends fire through Rome and burns these temples of these pagan gods. And so, as you can see, I hope that you understand why I feel the way I do about Rome being the Babylon of Revelation, because it had become that. It had become the center of pagan worship in the known world, whereas that had been Babylon in the past. And we saw that progression. We saw it in Daniel. It went from Babylon to Persia to Greece to Rome. We saw that through the pantheon of gods. They all matched between all of those different pagan nations, including back before that in the Akkadian, the Sumerian, the Babylonian. It's all the same group of gods and goddesses that were worshipped. But then God orchestrated this amazing thing where by the time that he intended to judge not only the Jewish nation for its wickedness, he had brought these pagan gods into the empire of Rome to be worshipped at that point in time so he could then exact judgment upon them as well. And judgment upon Rome for coming against his people, even though that was part of the plan in judgment. Rome was still a wicked partner in crime here. And so this judgment on both Rome and its pagan gods, the seat of power of the pagan gods of Babylon, was just an amazing discovery for me as I researched this stuff. And I think that it's important for us to understand this because it shows us how Satan and his cohorts, these pagan gods, these ancient fallen angels, tricked humanity throughout history to worship them time and time again. And God knew of the wickedness of these angels and ended up judging them and taking them out, giving them shame on the earth, so that for all time, as you saw in these photos of these ruins, they are anathema. We see the folly of that. Even in our modern time, we see the ruins attributed to those gods and goddesses. They were put down by God. The authority of those gods and goddesses was made low. Do you understand now all those prophecies in the Bible that talk about those very things? Where in the prophets, God is going nation by nation. He's not talking to a king or a group of people. He's talking to these angels behind these kingdoms, saying, you will be made low like a man. You will be brought low. And he did that. He did that in this time period, where he judged not only his people, but then judged the gods of Rome at the same time. The gods of Babylon, the same gods, the gods of Persia, the gods of Greece, and the gods of Rome. So I hope that makes sense to you. It was a startling revelation to me. One it's going to affect everything as far as my study and my research from here on out in this time period. I think it is vital to understand how this progression of the pagan nations took place and what God did in the end to display his power over those pagan nations, the authority of Christ over those pagan nations. Thank you for joining me for this session. I appreciate you, and I hope you've gotten a lot out of this study and that you can go and find out even more about these pagan nations and gods that God, the Most High God, judged. Thank you for your time. God bless.